Harold Torger Vedeler has done a lot of writing. In one case, he drew Sumerian cuneiform tablets literally from the Yale Babylonian collection. His most infamous work is no doubt Donuts of the Gods, a parody of pseudoscience which has been used as a textbook in college courses. And then finally, you can see his varied science fiction and fantasy, where one story, Ilium, received an honorable mention in the year's Best Fantasy and Horror 2008, the 21st annual collection. Rumors that he is actually a space alien are probably exaggerated.
Oh, well, thank you. That's quite a glowing introduction. Usually I receive introductions with more profanity. Anyway, so thank you. This is a little book I wrote, I guess, a couple of years ago. I don't remember where I got the inspiration. It's actually got 3 stories, the longer of which is called The Christmas Witch, which I will read starting at the beginning. I figure that's probably the best thing rather than give away the ending here. So this is the Christmas Witch. So let's begin. It was a long time ago, the children all say, that the old house became scary, a frightening place of mystery and gloom there at the end of the street. Cut off from its neighbors by a ragged wooden fence and 2 empty lots beside, the thick trees around the back, it loomed large in the mythology of the neighborhood and the town, a frightening story yet untold. Dark windows marked its face, and closed doors, the yard unkempt and overgrown by thorn and thistle. 2 floors and the basement below, and a small attic above, a pitched, shingled roof of the unadorned siding. The windows that faced the street rarely showed more than drawn curtains, and who knew what lay behind that drapery? There was occasionally smoke from the chimney, no doubt from the simmering of some noxious brew, and the reputation of the place made it easy to ignore the modern utility meter on one wall, or even the fact that there was a small garage, unless, of course, that was where the witch kept her flying broomsticks. But really, this creepy reputation was hardly the fault of the children. Beginning very young, they were all warned, stay away, by parents and teachers who watched the place and shook their heads and let those warnings take on a life of their own in young imaginations. The old woman there is bad, she is mean, she is cruel, the children then told one another. She'll gobble you up. An old hag with a wart on her nose will boil you into stew, or she will chase you into darkness, and you will never return. Now, none of this is to say that the witch never emerged from her dark abode. There she was sometimes, a cane in her left hand, her shoes making a click, click, click sound as she walked over the sidewalk, her gaze straight ahead, never looking at you, never seeming to notice that you were even there. Down the short street from her dark house to turn left and make her way, people parting before her like the Red Sea before Moses. Click, click, click. Occasionally, she went to the cemetery, and for the children and more than a few adults, this too was clear proof of her witchcraft. She would go to a particular grave and there stand before it, sometimes muttering quietly to herself. What she muttered was never really clear, for no one ever wanted to get close enough to listen. This, too, must be dark magic, they said, and although the gravestone was well tended and never bereft of flowers, it, too, was still probably cursed. And, of course, even witches must eat. So you would occasionally see her at the store with her little cart of groceries, buying oatmeal. We all know that unsweetened oatmeal is a favorite food of witches. And sometimes she went downtown to the bank, because likewise it is common knowledge that witches hoard gold coins. So when she did emerge from her dark and weathered home, the townspeople would stare, drawing their children back and whispering amongst themselves after she had gone out of earshot, adding rumor to speculation and turning this into myth. How old is she? No one knows. She came here from outside. Outside? Some other town. I never heard which one. Probably out of state, though. Came with Omar McCamey. When he got back, I heard. They were already married. And? A shrug. Like I said, no one's sure. Omar never said much about what he did those years he was away, but I heard he made money. A lot of money. And then he died and she got it all? Eyes would narrow. Sounds suspicious. They said it was a stroke that killed him, but he was only in his 40s, which is awfully young. Black widow? I'm not saying, but look how she dresses. A frown, maybe a scowl. Well, if you're really so curious about her, you could always ask Mr. Handel. He handled Omar McCamey's will. But the lawyer and banker, Mr. Handel, that's 2 L's at the end, by the way, not one like the composer, and yes, I am aware of the verbal pun in the sentence above, never said anything about the witch's business with him, which was proper, after all, and it is important that you all know that Mr. Handel was a very proper man. He had that tall and professional bearing of his trade, always with a suit and tie, smiling on occasion only, the books in all accounts neatly kept. This brought him affection and quiet admiration from the townspeople, who knew that their money was safe with him in any event, and so whatever he might know about the witch, they were content to let him keep it to himself. And so it was. 1 year, and then another, and another, Halloweens in succession, until children she had frightened became adults with children of their own, still watching her, still whispering and wondering if she had always been this old, if as a witch she could age at all. The witch, the crone, the hag. But let us put Halloween aside, however appropriate it might feel, since it was easy to ignore the old house and the witch and the creepy late October night and seek your treats from other, more promising homes. These would have plastic skeletons and glowing false scary lights to mark them, and you went out secure in the knowledge that it was really only Mr. Sneed or Mr. Beckhofer shaking the tree branches with a good-natured laugh, or Mr. Cisneros commenting with mock alarm at the cleverness of your costume, which each then to distribute the expected reward of candy and treats. But Christmas, Christmas was something more, something special. Indeed, in the small town, that most holy and joyful of holidays, the day of goodwill towards men and the redemption of Ebenezer Scrooge and the Grinch and the television adventures of Rudolph and Hermie and Yukon Cornelius. It was songs and family, and most of all, at least if you were one of the children in the town, the bright downtown lights and all the presents to follow. For even though they had a witch, this was a town that took its Christmases, and along with them its Hanukkahs, very seriously indeed. Why this was, no one really knows, but just as with the lawyer and banker Mr. Handel, it is important for our tale that you understand that it was so. And of all the people in the small town, no one took the obligation to celebrate Christmas more seriously or with more vigor and zest than Jip A. Batten III. If by circumstance or even simple forgetfulness you neglected your holiday duty, if your storefront was not awash with color and decoration, if you did not join in the singing of carols and act to spread the holiday spirit far and wide, there was always Jip A. Batten III on hand to remind you to do so. Jip, you see, was everything the witch was not. a vocal, public, gregarious man. He came from an old money family that had settled in town as its summer home more than a century before and taken a liking to the place. His grandfather and father and an uncle had each been mayor, the uncle twice. And his home was that big one, so hard to miss in the best neighborhood. He had patrician roots here, and he was proud of them. More than any of this, however, Jip loved Christmas, adored everything about it, and like so many of us, his affection for the holiday was presumably based on fond childhood memories. What a wondrous time that must have been in the old Batten household, people said, as every year they witnessed Jip's passion for the tinsel and the ribbons and the happy songs. As early as August, he would already be planning the festivities and charitable fundraisers, meeting with the town council and assuring them that this year's celebration would be better than the last, that there would be more lights downtown and more displays in the store windows, and a longer line of children for Santa than ever before. Santa himself was selected with care, auditioned for belly and ho, ho, ho by Jip himself. Indeed, if he saw you and thought you qualified, you can be sure he would call until you agreed to come in for a jolly audition, because nothing was too good for Christmas, nothing at all. This great effort eventually paid great dividends. And with time, the town's holiday reputation spread. In December, people would come from cities all around, and they would remark at the spirit of Christmas here, lining up to shake Jip's hand and praise him for his effort. "It's nothing, really," he always said. "You're too kind. Merry Christmas." But there was still the witch. And it didn't take long for Jip to notice the empty space among the neighborhood decorations. Every year he would drive by and look at the dark, solemn house and shake his head, a frown crossing his features, because every year this was the single place where there were no lights, where there was no joy, where the spirit of Christmas seemed conspicuously so absent. "Isn't there some way we can get her on board?" he asked the town council one year after a fruitless effort of knocking on the witch's front door 3 times in 4 days. "Maybe an ordinance we can invoke? What does it say about us that this one person can just ignore the holiday?" He looked at the men and women of the council. "Just look at that place she lives in. It's a wreck. Is her home even up to the fire code?" "It is," said the fire chief, whose name was Mr. Biskowitz. "The roof was replaced only 5 years ago, and the boards on her walls are the year before that, even if she didn't come out while they worked. Her accountant, Mr. Handel, handled everything. So maybe it's not pretty, but her house is livable and safe. She isn't breaking any laws." "Well," said Jip again, "it just isn't right, not celebrating either Christmas or at least Hanukkah. It's just not neighborly. Something should be done." And he sat down with a frown as they began to debate the endless and unfathomable excitement of zoning ordinances. Now, say what you will, dear reader, but no one could ever accuse Jip of giving up easily. He thought about the silent, dark house for a long time, and when a few years later he came up with his answer and a scheme to go along with it, it just happened to be the same chilly autumn that young Betsy Shore knocked the old witch down. And that's chapter 1. Shall I go on? Okay, chapter 2. Now, young Betsy Shore was certainly more than 4, rendering such a Dr. Seuss rhyme about her quite unworkable. But do not forget that she was no adult either. Instead, we may say that Betsy lay in that awkward age between the magic of childhood and it's beginning to yield to the harder truths of adolescence, to responsibility and maybe a little rebellion, though not there yet. Whether she actually believed in Santa Claus, not only she could really say, but like everybody else in town, she was certain about the witch. Betsy's home, after all, was just down the street from the ancient, scary house, and Betsy's parents had always reminded her to leave the old woman alone, not to go over there, a lesson easy to instill in a child when the place looked like it did. And Betsy did love Christmas. After all, like the other children of the town, are not so little anymore. Betsy had grown up with the dazzle of Gyp Batten's Christmas lights, with parades and storefronts and gifts with ribbons. She, like all of us, had heard again and again the 10 sacred, dishonest, and unachievable words of American retail, amplified into a frenzy for the holiday. The customer is always right, and you get something for nothing. And more than these, there had been the chants and songs that everyone sang beneath them, or loudly broadcast on radio and television and internet and street corners everywhere, easy to distill in the joy and excitement of the season. Shop, 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 shop. Christmas love is found in a package with bows. How many times had she rushed downstairs on Christmas morning to find her stocking full of treats? How many times in the living room, shining with decorations and surrounded by bright boxes of joyous mystery? From the lists of desires she and her siblings made every year to trips to the mall to point out those desires, every season was a wonder. But our story is about the witch, isn't it? And so let's return to her. It began with something small, you know, just a little thing, almost nothing at all. Shopping for groceries one autumn day, the aisles busy, children squawking to mothers and fathers, infants screaming and testing patience, while overworked and underpaid retail clerks labored at the registers or stocked shelves, some of them trying to explain to impatient customers that sometimes advertised things just run out of stock, that this is not the end of the world and is nobody's fault, least of all theirs. The mayhem of a Saturday afternoon, a week and a half before Thanksgiving. And there was Betsy, rushing through in the kind of hurry only a young girl can achieve, around a corner, looking back instead of forward. Ter-clunk. The basket falls, cans and little bags scatter, a crown of broccoli here, a box of tea bags there. And then, not so little anymore, Betsy looks up. Only the sudden silence greets her, for there, sprawled on the floor, was the witch. Betsy's first instinct, the logical, reasonable instinct, hammered into her through years of warnings and stories of children boiling in pots, was to run. Perhaps, in fact, had they been outside, had there not been people all around blocking the way, she would have. But it was too crowded with shoppers and carts and an employee or two, so there was no escape for our poor young Betsy. Instead, those critical seconds passed, and she simply stared at the fallen woman, jaw agape. What do you see, young Betsy? The witch! The old hag with a crooked nose and a malevolent stare, the subject of a lifetime of warnings? Or, what do you see, gentle reader? What do any of us ever really want to see? What do we choose when we pass another? How do we judge? How are we judged? And there is, perhaps, the most remarkable thing of all. Betsy stared at the witch, gawking for those crucial few seconds. And then she got up. She got up and she stepped to the old woman, words coming from her mouth that would have been inconceivable even a minute before. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" No one moved as the witch looked back at her. Perhaps they awaited a curse, a bitter tirade about the clumsiness of youth, perhaps even a magic spell. But instead, there were only words, in a voice raspy from disuse. "I think so." Mr. Zorn, herding his own 2 small children, acted then, joined by Ms. Macpherson and then Walter the clerk, who had been stalking beans. They abandoned their carts and stepped forward. They helped the witch to her feet, and Betsy began to pick up the mess. A bottle had broken, leaving a stain of strawberry jam on the floor, mixed in now with shards of glass that rendered it quite inedible. And when Betsy saw this, she saw something more without thinking, something that would change everything forever. "Let me get you another one." The witch looked at her, and Betsy froze, still expecting a snarl, a curse, maybe a cruel word. But instead, there was, to Betsy and everyone else's surprise, only a shy smile. "Thank you." News got out, and in time it got to Jip Batten. He was sitting in his office when it did, well immersed in planning and organizing, with only a little more than a month to go before Christmas Eve. As always, he was excited, humming carols in anticipation, checking every detail. It would be bigger this year, better, and of course there would be all those people wanting to talk to him and about all that he had done. He even had a new necktie picked out with Santa and the reindeer soaring amongst through the night. "Did you hear?" his secretary asked. "Hear what?" "The witch. There's quite a buzz. A little girl knocked her down at the store. I heard about it from Ms. Laidlaw, who heard it from Mr. Beveridge and his office, who I think heard it from someone who was there. Knocked the old hag right down and toppled a display, maybe 2. That poor kid. Now, as I mentioned before, it would be untrue to say that Jip had forgotten about the witch. Indeed, she and her holiday isolation had been more and more on his mind this year. So since his latest drive by her dim and dismal house, an idea began to brew in his head, one he thought that might just work. He turned from his computer. "Tell me more." These are always dangerous words, because for many of us, your humble narrator sometimes included, I'm afraid, it is the talking that matters, not what is said. And when 2 or 3 or 4 people talk who know little, it is a natural human failing for each to start embellishing, claiming that they know more than we actually do. So soon enough, it is the story, not the events, that really matters. In this case, when the story was over at last, poor Jip knew only, but with great certainty, that the witch had shouted at the innocent girl and waved her gnarled cane at her, and that at least 100 people had seen her do it, and then the old woman had left the store with threats of lawsuits and other needless mischief. This, he told himself with a confident and self-directed nod, is what comes from not celebrating Christmas. Meanwhile, as rumors spread like bubbles forming in an overheated cauldron, Betsy walked the witch home, helping carry her groceries. We do not know, and nor did she, just why she did this. Maybe it was a sense of obligation for her carelessness, wanting to make sure the old woman was really all right. Or maybe it was curiosity. This was the witch, after all. Or maybe, just maybe, Betsy was seeing something in the hag that no one else in town had ever seen before. But whatever the reason, the 2 of them got to the old house and up to the front door, and there the witch opened it and turned to the girl. A quiet smile, almost shy, crossed her wrinkled face. "Thank you," she said. "It's all right," Betsy answered, and then she added, "I live right over there." "I know," said the witch. "You do? You and your sister and brothers sometimes play in the front." It had never occurred to Betsy, just as it too seldom occurs to any of us, that those we might watch could be watching us as well. And if the witch's voice was quiet, and it was, that did not mean she was silent. Quiet and hidden, but suddenly real. Her eyes on the old woman, Betsy spoke again. "If you need anything." The witch reached out and touched Betsy's hand. Her fingers were warm, and she nodded. "Thank you." As she turned to cross the street for home, Betsy wondered if she had actually seen a tear forming in the old woman's eye. "Preposterous," the old voices said. "Witches never weep." That's chapter 2. That's good? Yeah. Okay.
All right. Questions?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start. So, by training, you are a historian of the ancient world.
Yes.
How, if at all, does that inform the fiction that you write, which is not historical, right? Which is not what I would, is not...
That's a really good question that I've asked myself. Sometimes it does more than other times. Sometimes I use ancient stories to tell modern stories. But unbeknownst to anyone who's ever had me in a class or anything like that, I've been writing for as long as I've been doing academic stuff. So the two the two pillars of my my life, as it were. I've always loved fiction. I've always loved writing. I hope I've gotten better at it over the years. When I was young, I wrote some really dreadful stuff. And I remember someone told me once, they said, "You actually have to write 10 years of bad writing before you can write well. The more you write, the quicker you burn through the 10 years. So if you want to be a writer, you want to start writing a lot and expect to write badly." And I have some stuff in notebooks from my youth that are just dreadful. But I always enjoyed it. And in college, I took some creative writing courses, and I started writing. And one of the books up here, in fact, was started in college. But it's interesting because, of course, history is filled with stories. And in fact, history, the word itself, comes from story. Human brains, because neuroscience is another one of my interests, human brains assemble the world with stories. It's how we interpret the world around us. We are not, contrary to what we'd like to believe, impartial observers of reality. We always turn it into narratives, and neuroscientists are now discovering more and more that this is not only the case, but that we have to do it. So for me, and I've gotten way off your question, but for me, narratives and stories are really not just fun, although they are really how we think. And what I have wondered at times is, how far back in our evolution do you have to go to start seeing this happen? I sometimes wonder if dolphins have narratives. Do chimpanzees have narratives? These are really interesting questions, to which I don't have an answer. I don't know if anyone does, since we can't actually talk to them. But narrative is how we interpret the world. And so storytelling is how we interpret the world. And this goes way long before writing. Sitting around the fire, our ancestors a million years ago probably had some form of storytelling to it. So anyway, I just like to do it, and I had to take a break from doing much of it when I did my graduate school and all that sort of thing. But now that I'm old, and I'm like the old witch here, I'm getting back into it more and more.
Other questions?
Yes.
Is there a reason that you wrote any of your books that meant a lot to you?
One of these up here, not this one, but one of them, the first one I actually wrote and got published, Intersect, was a dream. And I've always believed that we should try to pay attention to our dreams. I think that most psychologists would hopefully agree with me about this. Every now and then, I will have a dream that is so powerful and so vivid that I literally wake up and I just start to write. And many years ago, I had such a dream, and I got up and thought, oh my gosh, and I started writing and writing and writing and writing, and there was no order. When you write initially, the first thing to keep in mind is it's a first draft. So you don't necessarily write in order, chronological, anything like that. You just write, you get it down. And I had this dream, and I sat down, and I just started writing and writing and writing. And then I had to go to work. I used to sell cameras. And then I got home, and I went back to writing and writing and writing. And this went on for 3 days, which is very odd. Most of the time, we forget our dreams within, 10 minutes of waking up. This one, I still remember this dream, very vivid. And it's the story that emerged from all of the notes and stuff that I then eventually put together into a narrative was the first real novel. It's not the first novel I ever wrote. That one is dreadful, and I hope to God nobody ever reads that. But the second one, which is Intersect, I finally assembled it, and then, of course, I had it published. And that one was a lot of fun and really interesting to write. And there's a lot of that dream still in there. And again, I have the original notes, so someday if someone is interested, they can study the evolution of that story. But that is it's a really interesting question: is where does any artist, author, painter, composer, where does it come from? And I don't really know. All I do know is that I can't not write. And I posed this question, I think it was on Facebook not long ago, in one of these writing groups that I have joined. And I said, if you were to live your life, and you knew that when you died, that everything you've ever written, everything creative you've ever done, would be destroyed, and it would never be looked at by any other human being, would you still do it? And I don't have an answer to that question. The question is, when you create something, you presumably are often doing it because it's a social activity. We are, again, ultra-social beings. This is why our eyes are in the middle of our head and our brains are so big. Whereas if you look at a chimpanzee, their head stops right here, because we have big brains and their brains are not as big. I wonder if they have stories, but we have big brains. And we are social. We call it ultra-social. So we do things so we can interact with other people. And if we don't interact with other people, we do go crazy. So storytelling of any kind is a basic part of human identity. But if you knew that whatever you created would never be seen and would be lost forever on your death, would you still do it? And I posed this question into this Facebook group just to see what kind of responses I got, because many people go on Facebook and promote their book because they want to sell copies, which is totally understandable. But if you knew that, would you still do it? And I got some very interesting answers, and I think I still would, because I can't not do it. And if that's the case for any of you, you need to do it. So.
It was mentioned earlier that you write a lot of science fiction, and I was wondering, because there's so many different types of science fiction, and I think some misconceptions about the genre. Like, what were some of the authors or the types of science fiction that you had read or had influenced your decision to write this?
When I was young, I read a lot. And recently I've been going through old boxes and found just piles and piles of science fiction books. So when I was young, I did read quite a bit. My tastes evolved over time. When I was quite young, I liked Heinlein and Clarke and these, and those are classics. And then I got a little older, and I got to college, and I had a class on science fiction, and the professor said that most of those are really not that great. And I got very upset. And I said, what do you mean they're not? And then he said, no, you need to read some of these other things. And so eventually I found my way into people like Ursula Le Guin, who I'm still upset they never gave her a Nobel Prize. Her work is amazing to me. And partly it's because her father was an anthropologist and I studied anthropology, but also she has a touch to her. And one of the things that I notice is that her heroes, her protagonists, are generally not the typical protagonists of science fiction. who are usually adventurers, who usually have, you think of Star Wars, they have adventures. They're fighting against the evil Darth Vader, etc. And Ursula Le Guin did something very different. And there's a story I heard once that I have no idea if it's actually true, but I heard the story. She was talking to Roger Zelazny, who was brilliant, by the way. I love his work. She was talking to him, and she said, you have this army, a bunch of guys marching along in your story. And he said, yes, I'm marching along. And she said, they're marching past a bunch of peasants who are out growing food. And she said, you mention the peasants, and then you go on with the story. What is the story of those peasants? What is their story? And Zelazny said, it doesn't really matter. They're sort of decoration, really. And, of course, Le Guin said, no, that's really the story. Who are those people? And that has always stayed with me, that she, of the science fiction writers that I was familiar with when I was younger and that I've read a lot of, she's the one whose characters are peasants, whose characters are frequently disempowered women, for example. One of my favorite characters she ever created was Teynar. It's a fantasy story, and Teynar is, a priestess, and she has, adventures getting out of this dark place she was in. But Teynar then goes to become basically a mother and a peasant, and gets married and has children and has a family. That's her story, is getting to that point. And I always thought that's so interesting, because normally you have heroes who have great adventures, they overcome the challenge, and you have a Star Wars style march at the end with great music, and you get a medal, and Han Solo and Luke Skywalker get medals. I still think Chewbacca should have gotten a medal. I'm kind of annoyed about that. But they have a heroic end of the story. And of course, in the case of Star Wars, then you have some of the later movies, The Empire Strikes Back, which is fascinating because the bad guys win, which doesn't happen in Hollywood very often. And after that, I kind of lost track of Star Wars. But in most science fiction and fantasy, that's the trope. That's what you do, is the hero triumphs over some physical challenge posed by the villain. And that's a perfectly good story. But Le Guin said it's not the only possible story. And so I wrote a couple of short stories just very recently, and I've been sending them out, seeing if I can find anyone who's interested. And one of them is about a peasant trying to get help for his daughter who is sick. And he has no money, no power, nothing. He's just trying to get help. That's the whole story. And it's been rejected several times. I suspect they looked at it and said, what the heck is this? Those stories are very interesting to me. And that is something that the genre of science fiction and fantasy, I think, has neglected. And I love Le Guin's work partly because of that. So call me a fan. Even though I love some of the others, Zelazny and Tolkien and those, they're amazing. But Le Guin always struck me for that reason.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.